Yeah, I just think if we're going to build something that is smart like a person, it will probably have to be like a person.
Interesting.
In some ways. Yeah. But I also don't care. Like, I just don't give a shit. It's not obvious to me that we want AGI. I don't wake up in the morning and say, gee, I wish my computer was a person. I think this technology is wild. I still get very excited about it all the time. But I don't think it's a clear path to AGI. I don't think we're going to be making digital gods anytime soon. I think we're going to be making sequence models. I think models that take in a series of words and predict the most likely next word based on a data set they were trained on. That's what this technology is. That's what it's always been. That makes them extremely useful at a bunch of stuff. Emotionally, I would definitely want to speak to other first-time founders and say, like, it's really stressful. And regardless of what's actually going on, the emotional valence will be the same. So you should know as you're going along that every challenge you're facing, that's the hardest challenge you've faced so far. And it's going to feel all-encompassing. And then later you're going to look back and you're going to say, how quaint. But the emotional impact will always be the same. So you gotta chill out. You gotta figure out how to handle it because it won't get easier.
Before we start today, could you just do me a really quick, really small favor? Can you just take your phone out of your pocket, open up Spotify, open up Apple Podcast, open up whatever player you're using and give the show 5-star? You can think of it as like your good deed of the day because it's not just for me, it's for all other founders. If you like the show, if you get value out of the show, when you review the show, other founders are way more likely to find it. So this is like your philanthropic moment of the day. And yes, if you're thinking to yourself, is this really for me? Is he really talking to me? He must be talking to somebody else. No, I'm actually specifically talking to you. So please take a handful of seconds. If you like this show, rate it, give it 5-star, write something. Whatever you do, you're going to be helping not just me, but so many other founders. Thank you. And I hope you enjoy today's episode. Well, Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
I have to start with this question. You started like 2019, 2020. We're now like 4 or 5 years later. Did you ever think in your wildest dreams that you would be that what would happen to AI has happened, and second of all, that you'd be now like the CTO and co-founder of $5 billion startup that just raised one of the largest rounds in Canadian history?
Well, no to some of those, and yes to some of them. One correction: I'm not the CTO anymore.
Okay.
I'm a co-founder now. Yeah, we have. That's one of actually the great things about being in a company that has grown this quickly is I've gotten to do a whole bunch of different roles at the company. So I was the CTO for a while. I am not anymore. And to be clear, now that we have hundreds of employees, it's been great to bring in people who've had more experience managing teams of that size. To answer your questions,
what is your role now, by the way?
I jump around a lot. So I've over the years, I just kind of fill the gaps and do whatever needs to get done until I find somebody who's better at doing the thing that I'm doing. And then we hire them and I go fill some other gap.
Nice.
So that's actually one of the really enjoyable things of being a founder is you get to move around and get a little bit of experience everywhere. To go back to what you asked, did I ever expect AI to get to where it is now? Yes. It's actually kind of gone pretty much the way I expected it to, with the one notable exception of data efficiency of reinforcement learning from human feedback. So that's the one thing that when we started this, I knew that language models were going to be as useful as they are today. I knew they were going to be as powerful and as general purpose. I will also say I knew that they were going to have the limitations that they have. I did not think you could take a generic web text trained language model that's just trained on all the text from the open web and refine it via feedback from people and have such a massive effect on the ease of use of language models. So that's the one thing that caught me by surprise. I think that caught pretty much everybody, but the people in OpenAI by surprise, was that you can have a relatively small number of examples from people, fine-tune the model on that, and then it's a lot easier to work with. So I don't know if your listeners are familiar with LLMs kind of pre and post ChatGPT, but before ChatGPT, if you wanted to get them to do something useful, you had to spend a bunch of time prompt engineering and figuring out how to kind of set up this weird prompt to get them.
This was with GPT, what? Was that GPT-3 or GPT before GPT-3 even?
That was before GPT-3. ChatGPT was like a particular fine-tuned version that was fine-tuned off of examples of chat, and it was the data efficiency of that really surprised everybody. And that's kind of what caught the world up with the excitement of the LLM community that we had before. So that was surprising. But otherwise, the utility of them, the ubiquity of them is not surprising.
Like even the speed to where we got here?
Yeah, I think, I don't think it's that surprising. I think all of that was pretty obvious after the first few scale ups of transformers. Yeah, except for this data efficiency thing. This thing really, it is surprising. And just to dive into that a little bit, like when you train a text model, you train it on just a huge amount of written text. And that ends up being like terabytes of text. And then when you fine tune a model on feedback from people, it's a comparatively really small amount of data. And like, that's a really scientifically interesting thing.
So we'll dive more into that shortly, but maybe then take us back to that time, like in 2019, 2020. Just give us like the origin story on Cohere, how it all started. Particularly interested in, where you thought the market might go at that time, especially since things seem to have played out kind of more or less according to plan.
So back in 2019, this was 2 years after the paper Attention is All You Need came out, which is a paper that introduced the architecture that all language models are based off of now. And that paper was written by a bunch of people at Google, one of whom was Aidan Gomez, who is our co-founder and CEO. And he kind of got this whole thing together. So he was involved in that paper. And it was shortly after that he realized, hey, like this is a unique and new moment in machine learning. And the unique and new moment is we're training truly like general purpose machine learning models. Before this, if you wanted to use a machine learning model to do something like, I don't know, recognize cats, you were best served by creating an image recognition model and training it only to recognize cats. That was ideal. Like if you had some vision task, the best model you were going to get at that was a model that was trained for only that. Language models were this new thing. Whereas if you wanted a language model to do, extract numbers from a PDF or summarize a call transcript or doing something like that, this was the first time where you were going to be best served by a general purpose language model that was trained on as much like all language in general. And that would be the best model for that task. So that's a really cool and new moment. And it's that realization that prompted Aidan to say, hey, like there's an opportunity here and indeed a need for a company to train a general purpose language model and make it available for enterprises. And that's what we did. So he got excited about that and then convinced me and Ivan, our other co-founder, to quit our jobs and start the company. And we've been doing that since. And
what was happening at that time? Like 2019, I mean, OpenAI was working on its own thing. I mean, I'm sure like the big guys, Google, et cetera, were like, well, what did the market look like then when you decided to do this, but specifically for the enterprise?
The market didn't really exist. At that time, there was nobody selling access to large language models.
Were there players that you saw would go a particular way? Like, did you think about where others would go, or it was just like totally open space?
We knew OpenAI would be going after this. Yeah. But it was pretty new. It was still pretty new.
And so where did you go from there? What was kind of step one after that realization that there was an opportunity there?
Well, step one was to figure out what to do and how to start it and hire a few people and start building. We started, work with the three co-founders and three founding engineers and started working on language models early 2020.
What was why the enterprise?
The enterprise, because we're all very pragmatic people and we all really want this technology to be useful. And where I think it is most useful is inside enterprises. So both for their internal use and for building stuff for customers. But I think that's where it adds the most value. Like, I think it's very fun to chat to a LLM, just like as a consumer. Like, I think that's enjoyable, but I don't really do it for fun on a daily basis. I do use an LLM on a daily basis to help me with work. And I think that's really where this technology shines.
And so how long does it take to like build, like, I mean, you can't really MVP this stuff, can you? So like what is building when you're a foundational AI company, like what does building that first product look like? How do you set things up?
It was a long time ago and it has moved quickly. So I might get some of the details of our history wrong. But at the time we started and we just started setting up the infrastructure and going over data sets to create our first version of a language model. And I think we spent a bunch of time in the beginning working on setting up infrastructure to train really large language models in a way that we knew was probably inefficient, but demonstrated at least our ability. So when we started, we did not have the resources we have now. And this is a very resource intensive industry. Like it costs a lot of money to train a large language model because you have to pay for the compute. You have to get data and you have to get talent. All of those things are expensive. So we did not have the resources we have now. And so we were spending time kind of demonstrating that we knew how to do it and that if we had more resources, we could do it efficiently. So the first few months, we were training large language models in a way that we knew wouldn't scale because we didn't have access to compute. But it was good enough to say, hey, look, we can do this. And if we had more resources, then we could go and do it quickly. And we could train these models in a reasonable time frame. And we used that to go from our seed round into our Series A.
And were these like demos or like what did the model do at that time?
The same stuff, just the way we trained it was really slow. So when we first started training, we would, I think we started training not with like a single kind of supercomputer, but with small amounts of GPUs spread out throughout a data center. And that is very, very slow because you have to communicate between all of them. So it's really, really slow to do it. But it demonstrates, hey, look, we have the talent and we have we've collected the data. So that was enough to say, hey, well, if we had more resources, we could rent a lot of GPUs and then we could do this quickly.
How do you work backwards from having a commercially available product? Like how much time did you guys give yourselves to get there?
Well, yeah, this industry is a little different than probably a lot of your listeners in that it's more like the creation of a resource. Like in some ways, I mean, maybe this is an interesting time to have this conversation, but in some ways, it'd be like asking, what was your first MVP of a mine? Or it'd be like, oh, what was an MVP of an oil refinery? Some of these, if you think of them more like a utility, it's a little harder to think about because a language model that hasn't been trained is not useful. There's no MVP of that. I mean, you could train a small language model and you could try to communicate to somebody, hey, this, but better. Like that kind of works, but it's pretty hard to imagine how it's going to be useful until it's done. So in that way, it's more like a utility provider. It's like, what's the MVP of a power plant?
No, there isn't. I mean, that it kind of things go from 0 to 1. I mean, in a sense, like the ChatGPT thing is a little different, but like from the mainstream's user's perspective, it really was a 0 to 1 moment. Like the thing was kind of like not useful, non-existent, and then it was like incredibly useful and like prevalent everywhere.
So I think that's I've talked about this a lot, but I think that's a really interesting historical moment, like in the history of technology, because everything that you can do with a language model right after ChatGPT, you could pretty much do with a language model before. It just sucked in that it was like really hard to do. You had to spend a lot of time prompt engineering, and it was like required thinking in a really weird way. So instead of just asking the model to do something like, hey, write me a poem about a fish, you had to write as the prompt, the following is a poem about a fish, : new line, and then get the model to generate. So because it wasn't trained to be a chat model, it didn't know how to chat. It did know how to write the completion of documents. And so if you wanted it to do something, you have to set up the first half of the document to like trick it into doing the thing you wanted to do. But you could do everything. Refining it on chat doesn't make it much better at stuff. It just makes it a lot easier to use. That's a really interesting historical moment that like what woke people up to the possibility of language models was an ease of use.
So the models before weren't necessarily worse. Like you're saying ChatGPT's main, let's say, innovation is almost like a UI, like a UX kind of innovation.
In some ways, yeah. Yeah, like it's so the base model for language models is just trained to complete documents. So you give it a sentence, it writes the next sentence. You give it half a paragraph, it writes the second half of the paragraph. You give it half a page, writes the second half of the page. But it does that based on the way people write documents that are available for training. So it doesn't we don't run around on the internet and write me a poem about a fish and then write the poem about a fish. Instead, if somebody's writing something, that they'll probably write the following is my favorite poem about a fish, : new line, and then the poem or something. So you had to think in that framework. You had to think, okay, imagine the task that I want to solve, somebody has already solved, and it's on a website. What would the top of that website look like? And then that's how you would trick the model into doing something useful. The ChatGPT and all the models that people use now, they're those base models, then further trained on examples of people talking to a chatbot. And now, because it's trained on that, examples of chat logs, you give it a chat prompt and it will respond the way you would expect it to respond. But that's because it's trained on that data. Yeah, so that doesn't really make it better. It just makes it easier to use.
I'm curious, what was that moment like within, because we all experience, everybody experienced that moment, differently, but we're all kind of on the outside, even me as a VC, obviously we're looking at AI or whatever, but all of a sudden this happens and it's just this crazy 0 to 1 moment. For you, you're actually building a foundational model for years before this. You would, in the R&D world even before that. And then this happens. Like what happens internally at Cohere in the like last 2 months of 22 after ChatGPT?
Oh yeah. We were all surprised and excited. And the surprise and excitement was that we were like, wow, you really do not need very many training examples to take that base language model and turn it into a chat model. And then the chat model is quite easy to use. So we had been making chatbots before ChatGPT. Like I was running Discord bots with various chat models that were working already. But the way that I did that was with a really long prompt. So I had many examples of a chat conversation, and I had like set my prompt up so that it looked like a chat log you might find on the web. And then I would take a new message from a user and put it into the prompt and get the model to respond. So it was like, we were doing that for a long time, but we didn't think, hey, we could just take this base model, train it a little bit more on chat data, and get it to be a chat model. So when ChatGPT came out, we were all like, wow, that's a new finding. It's significantly more data efficient than we thought. That's really cool. And obviously, this is the way people want to use it. So we went about creating a data set to do that, but with a particular focus on making it useful in enterprise as opposed to being a chatbot for consumers.
Maybe talk to me about that. Like that's one thing I always think about is like just now, like you said, there was no market back then. Now there is a market, and there's different people playing in different places. Like you have the open source on one side, like Mistral, Llama, which we can talk about a little bit because that's, their new model came out or whatever. On the closed source side, you've got, whatever, OpenAI, Anthropic, Cohere. How do you guys view the world? Like, do you see people splitting the pie and taking different pieces of it, or are you all just kind of competing against each other? Like how do you guys think about the market and the way it might develop?
Yeah, the market is definitely competitive these days, but unlike some of the other industries, there aren't the same positive feedback loops. It's not like a social media in which if you're a single person using a social media, you're having no fun at all. And the more people there are, the better it is for everybody, for the most part. That's not the case with a large language model. There are some feedback loops, like more people use your model, you can, get better feedback from them, figuring out how to make it better, but it's not quite as massive. So it's a competitive market, but we have kind of carved out a niche in really only focusing in on what businesses and companies are trying to do with large language models and trying to make it good for them on those purposes. So we're not interested in making like a public facing bot for consumers to talk to. We're not interested in chasing AGI. We're not interested in there's a lot of like weird public benchmarks that exist trying to measure, how close we are to AGI or how close we are to things. Like we don't really care about any of that. We just care about when we talk to a company who's using our model, is it useful for them? Is it doing the thing they need it to do? And that's what we obsess over. And that's fairly unique within the foundational model companies. We're unique in our like singular focus of that.
What does that mean specifically? Like for an enterprise, what do you like? So I understand what you don't do. Like you don't waste time in consumer, waste time, You don't spend time in consumer. You don't spend time in AGI. But like, what do you do for an enterprise that might be different than what OpenAI offers or Llama 3 with whatever offers them today, 3.1, whatever?
Yeah, that what I've described now, this like not AGI, this enterprise focused thing, like that's a philosophical difference. Like how does that bear out in our actual product? Yeah. It means we have spent a lot of time figuring out how to serve a model in a data privacy preserving way. So we'll serve our model wherever. You can use our model on our platform or on any cloud provider or on-prem or like wherever. We'll host our model wherever your data is. That's like one thing. It means we spent a lot of time trying to make the model really good at retrieval augmented generation. That's one thing our model is very good. So you can give it a bunch of data and it can answer questions based on that data and give you citations so you can trust the answers. That's like something we've trained the model to be really good at. We've made it really good at multilingual.
And enterprises care specifically about that because they have a lot of data that they want to feed into these models in a secure way.
Yes. Even stronger than that, enterprises really care about that because if they're not giving it their own data, then they're just getting random stuff out of a model, which turns out to be not very useful. It's kind of like a necessity. If you wanted to answer questions about your company, you need to give it information about your company.
Mainly true, you would say, for internal use cases or equally so for external?
For everything but like consumer experiences where the enjoyment is just like, doing, or for some work automation. For example, people often use our model to, read, to format text, to do entity extraction or to do summarization or something like that. And that you can kind of give it the document it needs to be working off of and it answers it. But for, internal or external retrieval augmented generation is hugely important. So we spent a lot of time making the model really good at that. We've made it really good at multilingual stuff. So it's beyond English. It's in, our model is in all major business languages, and we'll keep pushing that. And we've made it particularly good at using tools. So it can tell you like, you can, same way, retrieval augmented generation, the model figures out what to search, does the search, then answers the question based on what it's found. Using a tool with an LLM is similar. You can give it, access to some database or access to some external function like a calculator or something. And the model can figure out when to use that tool and then use it. So we've made it really good at that. We've also invested a bunch in search in general and embeddings. So we have an embedding model as well, which helps with enterprises who have a whole bunch of data trying to find the relevant stuff. So we've made our embedding models really good at that. So those are that's a handful of, implementation, technical distinctions, but they all come from focusing first on the enterprise. I think what can we do to make this stuff as useful as we know it can be?
What do you make of this latest Llama 3.1 and just like open source in general? I mean, there's some people that basically every single time Meta puts something new out, they're like, open source is going to kill everything. They're going to, like it's free, right? So like free is a powerful word. And at least when it comes to like the ChatGPT, $20 a month, a lot of people are saying, well, that stuff's just going to go away. It's going to go to zero. Do you have a sense of how this stuff shakes out, how it all plays out?
Yeah. So I think it's important to draw a distinction between the open source as exists now and what that word often conjures up in people's minds. So Llama 3, like the stuff Meta's doing, great models, great engineers, really cool stuff. But it's not open source the way Linux is open source. It's not open source the way, like Wikipedia's contributions are open source, in that it's not created by a bunch of hobbyists for fun in their spare time. It's actually a very valuable asset that a large enterprise is choosing to give away for free for the purposes of notoriety, for the purposes of, getting people excited about a really cool technology. It's a little different. It's also not similar to Linux in that it's not building upon itself, right? Like the models that were released by as soon as a new model is released, the old ones are kind of irrelevant now. So when I think about Cohere's value, like it's not in the weights of any particular model. In fact, we've released our model weights for researchers as well. So if researchers want to use our model, like they can download the weights from Hugging Face, and I encourage people to do that, to play it out. Like our value is in the process which creates those models and improves them, the process which deploys them, makes them useful to people, takes feedback and improves them, integrates into your system, works with search and RAG and all of these extra things. The actual, the weights of any particular model are not super useful when you get into it. So I think it's really exciting to see Meta releasing the weights for models, because I'm a lover of this technology and I love to see people developing and building on it. But when I think about our commercial value, it's a lot more than just a static weights. It's the process which creates them and improves them and year over year makes them better. And it's the way in which we deploy them and give companies access to them.
What about on the consumer side? Like, do you think there's still a world where people pay $20 a month for ChatGPT when the stuff's like in WhatsApp and everywhere?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't anymore. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, partly I don't because I use our own model, and we do have a version where you can use it on chat with it online. Though that exists mostly for the purposes of demonstrating the utility to enterprises. So I use that as a daily chat model, and I use some other products which have chat built into them. So yeah, I don't know how sustainable that's going to be. But again, that's not really our focus, right? Like we're not interested in making a chatbot. We're interested in giving this technology to enterprises so they can solve real problems.
You mentioned, you kind of alluded to this earlier. You mentioned that you knew how powerful LLMs could be and how, what their limits were. Like what are their limits? How far can they go? And I think there's people on the spectrum of just, how much work these LLMs could take over, and others that think, maybe it's a little bit more constrained. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think this technology is wild. I still get very excited about it all the time, but I don't think it's a clear path to AGI. I don't think we're going to be making digital gods anytime soon. I think we're going to be making sequence models. I think models that take in a series of words and predict the most likely next word based on a data set that they were trained on. Like that's what this technology is. That's what it's always been. That makes it extremely useful at a bunch of stuff. And I think we'll get to a point pretty soon where you rely on as an individual at work on an LLM for a whole bunch of your daily tasks. Like I increasingly use an LLM to do stuff for me. Like I'll use our model and I'll say, answer this question and make a graph to give me the information of this. So I'll say, when I'm traveling around, I'll be like, look up these statistics about this and create a one-page document that summarizes the information I need. And
you find it's good? It's accurate?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's accurate, and we always provide citations. So I used to always check the citations and be like, oh, where, let me check this. I don't check the citations anymore because I checked them for a long time and they were always right. So now if I see something weird, then I'll check the citations. I'll be like, oh, is that true? But for the most part, I've come to trust the output of the model. So yeah, I think we'll get to some place where you use it as a daily part of your job. Like you'll go to work, open up Slack, open up, an email, and you'll open up a chat model and you'll like use a bunch of, whenever you can offload some mundane task you don't want to do, you'll offload it onto that model. And we're seeing people go to production with stuff like this already and see huge gains in productivity with it. So that's really exciting. I don't think we're going to get to a point where you will treat or think about an LLM as a person or a coworker. You will always know that it has very clear limitations and it can be useful when you give it the specific instructions of what to do. But it won't be useful for saying things like, plot out my next business strategy.
Sure. Really high level.
Yeah, it won't be useful for saying, which stocks are going to go up tomorrow. It won't be useful for saying, like high level conceptual stuff. That's not stuff that sequence models can do.
What about this concept of agents? Like that's been a buzzword lately, just agents that'll come in and replace specific jobs. Like how prevalent I feel like it's still, in most cases, people talk about agents like it's more idea than reality. Like, does that become reality in many cases?
Yeah. So I originally pushed back on the term agents because I don't like implying agency to sequence models. I don't like that. I think they don't have agency. They're sequence models. However, I have lost that nomenclature war.
Yes.
And everybody uses the term agent, so there's nothing I can do about it. So I got to lean into it. So when I think of agents, what I think of is language models being used as orchestrators to coordinate other aspects of computer processes. So you could like retrieval augmented generation, RAG. You could think of that as a really simple agent. What does the agent do? It takes in a question from a user. It makes a prediction of what needs to be searched, like searched on the web or searched in a database to answer that question. It then searches, finds the relevant information, and answers the question. You could think of that like an agent flow, except it's only got one tool, and that tool is search. We can do the same thing by adding in a whole bunch of tools. And you can imagine now, you have access to a search. Maybe you have access to an email client. Maybe you have access to a database. Maybe you have access to, some other API to, retrieve information or write information. And you could end up asking an agent something like, make me a plot of our 5 biggest customers from the last 2 months and our like 3 newest leads from the last week, and put that in an email and email my boss and write a brief summary of each of those businesses, like, businesses, use cases, and put that into a document in Google Drive. And an LLM could do that. Like what I've just described is very like that. That's within the realm of possibility. And that's what I'm excited about, this like agent stuff. It's like giving the model access to things beyond an LLM so it can begin to orchestrate tasks like that.
Those are like end-to-end workflows, but do you think that even takes over like a full job? Because a job is always, it's a series of workflows. I find like most jobs, there's higher level obviously, but like you think about the lower level jobs, it's a series of workflows plus edge cases, like the stuff that you couldn't really workflow. You're like, hey, did you do this? And you feel like it's more like this stuff becomes this kind of co-pilot thing. I'm using buzzword, trendy things, but like more of a co-pilot where a lot of your workflows get automated, they get a lot faster because of these agents? Or do you think like agents can really come in and just do, end-to-end roles just kind of obliterated as a result?
Yeah, I think they're going to more augment. And to be clear, I think that augmentation is huge and massively transformative. And when we see people, like we've already seen companies and customers using our tech to augment some workflow and get like a 50% increase in productivity as a result. Like it's super exciting. I think when you look at the work people do, there's actually a lot of edge cases they encounter all the time. And there's lots of things that they do that could not be done just on the world of just on text, just on the world of computers. They're actually done like in the real world based on communicating to people and reading subtle cues and all kinds of things that can't be replaced by an LLM. So I think we're all about to and are already getting more efficient and through augmentation. And that's like really exciting to me. But I don't foresee this completely replacing large roles. Yeah.
Why not? The other take you have that's a little different than others in the space is like your idea on AGI, right? Like that we're not, not that it's impossible. It's just like it's much further away than people might think. And LLMs are not necessarily the way to get there. Why not?
Yeah. This is an interesting question. So I've been saying this for a long time now. And I think right around ChatGPT or like a year and a half ago, it was more contentious. And people will be like, Nick, why don't you think, oh, we're going to get to AGI? It's so obvious. As the years have gone on, like more and more people agree with. I don't even get a lot of pushback on this anymore. I'm just like, yeah, this is obviously not going to get us to AGI. Why would you think it would?
I don't know if it was the fact that obviously the models have got better, but like the original ChatGPT, I think was maybe less constrained, less safe. And so like some of the answers were so far out there that it personified it. Like it made you think like it was a real...
But all of that was a probabilistic model of sequences, right? Like that's all the tech has ever been. And that's really powerful, but it's not AGI. And I think a year ago, people were like, yeah, this is going to be, we're going to get there. And as the models have gotten better, they've gotten way more useful. I think the economic output of these things is getting bigger and bigger and more useful. But I think it's pretty clear to people that just making them better isn't making them more human-like. It's making them better sequence models, which is like awesome, but it's not making them more intelligent in the way that we are intelligent. So yeah, I don't think we're going to get there. The fundamental reason for that is when people talk about AGI, really what they're talking about is it smart in the way that a person is smart? And like, no, because it learns in a completely different way than you learn, right? Like you do not learn language by hearing as much of it as possible and probabilistically predicting which is the next likely most word. You do a little bit of that. And if I want to get really specific, there are two parts of your brain called Wernicke's area and Broca's area that are responsible for language. One of them is responsible for the semantics of language. So if you have an injury in that part of your brain, you're able to speak in language that is well formed but devoid of meaning. The other one is responsible for the syntax of language. So if you have an injury in that part of your brain, you're able to communicate but not with correct syntax. So I think that the syntax part, that's like kind of what we've created. Like we're kind of really good at automating that. But your brain does so much more than that. And you don't learn by just seeing as many examples of this as possible. You learn by interacting with the world. You learn by having agency in it. You learn by, making predictions of the world and experiments in the world and validating them. And then you use language as a means of communicating that. We're only doing that language part right now. And that's all language models are going to do. So that's super powerful. Like I really can't understate how huge I think this is going to be and how it's already changed a lot of the way we work with computers and will continue to change. But I don't think it's going to get us to AGI.
What do you think we need to get? Like, is there a path to there or not really, or at least not like in the foreseeable future?
I'm not a dualist, so I think there's no reason why we couldn't at some point build a computer that is intelligent in the way humans are intelligent. I imagine if we do, it'll probably have to have several of the limitations that people have. So I imagine it will probably have to be embodied. I imagine it may need to be it may need to be mortal in some sense. I don't
Why is that?
know. I don't know. We're getting into really like
I know, but it just went that way. I was surprised by that answer.
Yeah, I just think if we're going to build something that is smart like a person, it will probably have to be like a person.
Interesting.
In some ways. Yeah. But I also don't care. Like I just don't give a shit. It's not obvious to me that we want AGI. I don't wake up in the morning and say, gee, I wish my computer was a person. I wake up in the morning and I say, gee, I wish I could do my work faster. Like, gee, I wish I didn't have to do this boring thing. Gee, I wish I could get I could get an LLM to automate a bunch of stuff I don't want to do. That's what I'm thinking about. That's what we care about. We're figuring out how can we make this useful.
That's right. I just want ChatGPT or whatever LLM to write my LinkedIn post for me.
Yeah, that sounds great. And you could say like, here's the thing I want to make. Give me here's the bullet point. Here's the graph I found. Help me write this. Like, that's great. Or you could even say, these are the types of things that I think are going to be useful. And these are the types of things I care about. The AGI stuff I think is like fun to think about, but it's not obvious. It's not an obvious need to me.
I think you mentioned earlier that your one big surprise was like the impact of reinforcement learning from human feedback. Yeah. What about that was so surprising?
It's a lot better than we thought it was going to be. Yeah, it required a lot less data.
That was your point there, that a little bit of data can make the model so much better.
Yeah, exactly.
And why does that work?
Why does that work? It's kind of an interesting question. I mean, it works in that like we have sequence models and then we train it a little bit more on a particular sequence and then it's better at those sequences. What's surprising is that it generalizes. So if you have, let's say you've trained a model and it's seen a lot of examples of summaries, right? Somebody writes an article on the bottom, they say summary : and then they've written the summary. So before, if you wanted a model to write a summary, that's what you do. You'd give it an article, you'd write at the bottom summary : and let it predict the summary. And it would do a pretty good job of that. So let's say the model is really good at that. And then you train it on a bunch of examples of people having casual conversations where somebody asks for something and the model does it. but they've never asked for a summary. They've never said, please write a summary of the article above. If you train it on just those conversations and it's never been asked to do a summary, it will still do a good job when you ask it to do a summary. So it generalizes to request is never been asked in the training data. That's cool. That's a bit of a surprise. Why does that work? There's like complicated answers about the mechanisms that LLMs learn while being trained on the data. And it so happens that, changing the weights to make it better at predicting conversational dialogue also makes it better at responding to user requests. Like that's interesting. But the answer is we don't have a great understanding, and it mostly comes from just we've trained it on a sequence, and so it's better at modeling that sequence.
This might be a little bit outside scope, but a lot of this is just from the vantage point of an early stage founder today and thinking about building in AI, whether it's truly a nice AI startup or it's AI is one of the features your SaaS company has. Do you have any thoughts about it? I guess the point I'm getting at is it's a tailwind on one hand because of all of the productivity gains that it leads to, and generally speaking, that's good for technology companies. It's also a really tough place to be because you have so much money and so many players, so much competition, right? You've got to worry about where the foundational model is going to go, what new features is especially on the consumer front, OpenAI and ChatGPT going to put out next. It's going to completely destroy my company. Even here's a silly example, 11 Labs, really good at voice. And then all of a sudden, ChatGPT, has a voice thing too. And so now there's a new competitive threat. Do you have any high level thoughts on how as a founder today building, you should think about the different players in the AI world, from the foundational models to the incumbents, and where you can position or what are the sort of things you need to think about before going out and building something that, 6 months from now is redundant because somebody else did it better with more money?
Yeah, I think people should figure out what's the problem they're solving. And then I think they should, after they've thought about that, think about, hey, could an LLM help me solve this problem? And if the answer is yes, then they should use an LLM to help them solve it. I think they shouldn't say, I really want to use an LLM. How am I going to use it? That's cool. They should instead say, what's the thing I want to solve? And then figure out if an LLM could help them. And the answer these days is often yes. Often, whatever problem you want to solve with a computer, there's probably a way that an LLM could be helping you. But it's not always yes. And there's sometimes when it's this is actually totally irrelevant the LLMs are not helpful for my business at all, and you shouldn't use them. That's less true. And I think less and less true as the years go on. I think at some point we'll get to a situation where companies are not AI companies the way companies are not app companies anymore, right? There was a time when everybody's we got to make an app. We're an app company. We're going to make an app to do this. And now it's just, you're a company and you're selling something. There's a good chance you have an app somewhere for some reason. Or even before that, there was a while where people were we're an internet company. We're going to have a website. We're an internet company. That's the thing. And now you're a company. You definitely have a website. It's definitely somewhere. I think we're going to get to that stage with LLMs. People aren't going to be differentiating themselves based on being an LLM, an AI company, an LLM company. They're just going to use an LLM when it makes sense.
I think the one challenge, so obviously, you need to start with problems and then kind of leverage technology to solve those problems. I think that's always true. One of the challenges, at least I see today from my vantage point, is the incumbents seem to be, and I'm curious your take on this because you're selling to a lot of enterprises, but they seem to be so much faster. If you go back to the internet example, Amazon really could start with, oh, here's the internet. What should we do? Oh, we should sell books. And by the time that the bookstores were truly selling online, or by the time Walmart really made a move to online, it was years later. So they got that big head start. Doesn't seem to be the case today. Today, it seems incumbents are a lot faster to push out these LLM driven, AI driven features. And at least for me, as somebody working with a lot of early stage startups, I'm a lot more worried about incumbent threats than I used to be, or than I think others were with, past kind of technology cycles.
I think that's an interesting point. I don't know if that point is specific to LLMs. I think that point might just be in general, the speed of development has increased, and incumbents are aware of their ability that they could, the possibility that they get disrupted. And so they're moving faster. I think LLMs might be a good example of that because it's the thing that people are rushing to these days. But it doesn't sound like the point you're making is specific to this technology. I also think the point is a little true, but kind of overstated. We heard the exact same thing. When I was oh, we're going to go make an LLM company, people were what the hell are you going to do? Google's going to do it first. Google's going to, incumbents. There's a bit of a myth, especially around early founders, Like the myth you're describing has always existed.
Always. I mean, why wouldn't Google do it? Why wouldn't X do it is always a question. And I guess the question is like, is it more prescient for AI and LMs or not really?
I think it's true that everybody's moving faster. Like people are developing things faster. I'm like, that's cool. It's cool to see people build stuff quick. So like, that's just true. But the myth you're describing has always existed, is often perpetrated by the incumbents to be like, oh, you shouldn't quit. We'll do it faster. You should stay here and do it here, you know? So that's been going on forever. But there's lots of companies that have come up, done something really quick and made something cool and moved faster than the incumbents. And I don't expect that to change.
Well, listen, Nick, it's been great having you on the show. We'll end it there. I will ask, actually, you know, we tend to end with two questions, and they're different because like what you're building is so different than most startups, but I'll ask them anyways. Like, was there a moment, or when was the moment when you felt like you had kind of true product market fit with Cohere? So
let me give you a maybe contentious answer. I don't, the notion of product market fit, I don't love, because it's similar to fitness within the notion of fitness within evolutionary theory, in that it's only post hoc. You can look at an animal and you can say, oh, this is fit for these reasons. Like, here's why this is doing really good in this niche. But it's very difficult to look at an animal and say, is it going to be fit? Or is it like, you know, it's really only something you can identify after the fact. Yeah. So I I often think when especially early stage startups are thinking about product market fit, they're thinking like, yes, I've convinced myself we have product market fit. This is the thing. And I'm like, you're never really going to know until you're looking back. So I think it can often mislead people. I think it's better to focus on a problem that you're passionate about and excited about and you think really needs solving, try to solve it. And one day you'll be like, well, there you go. We got it. But it's only something you can identify going back.
That's fair. But what was that? Did you have that moment?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, we had that moment. We've had that moment. We have bits of that moment a few times. One, when we first released our API, and we saw there was people who signed up to use it, and then we talked to them, and they were like, yeah, it's doing this thing for me. And I got especially excited when the thing it was doing for them was boring. That's when I would get most excited. Somebody would be like, oh, yeah, I'm using it, and I am summarizing a bunch of documents, and I no longer have to do that. And I'd be like, whoa, great. Or when somebody is saying, you know, I'm taking all of these, like quarterly earnings reports, and I'm extracting the numbers from them, and I'm putting them in a table. And I used to do that every day, and now I don't do that. Like, those are the things that I would get really excited about. And I'd say, great, that's like real value. We're adding real value there. That's a thing somebody didn't want to do. They don't have to do it anymore. So when we first released our API, I got that a little bit. Then when we started doing private deployments and on-prem deployments and cloud deployments, I got that even more. When I would see companies would be willing to say, yeah, like, we'll take a copy of the model and we'll do this thing, and that'll be great. I got that even more. As we've released more features, you get that a little bit with each feature. Like, we've released, you know, in our API, internet search, tool use, multilingual, all of these things. And every time we do it, and then we look into what people are using with it, we're like, oh, great, that's there and exciting. So yeah, we've had like bits of it, but it hasn't come in a single moment. It's come in slow increments of improving what we're building, adding features, talking to customers, and them saying, hey, we're doing this thing, and it's helping. Like, that's the moment. And that's happened several times.
Got it. And then my last question, like, having been on this like insane rocket ship over the last 5 years, what would be your one, like, either a big lesson learned or like one big piece of advice you'd have for yourself if you could go back, you know, 4 or 5 years ago when you were just starting?
I would say, chill out.
Tough. Easy to say. Tough
I know. It's advice that I know if somebody told me in the first year, I would have ignored.
You still wake up with your heart like pounding out of your chest, or
no?
You feel relaxed?
No. I've been having a good time, but it has been. Emotionally, I would definitely want to speak to other first time founders and say, like, it's really stressful. It's going to be really stressful, and regardless of what's actually going on, the emotional valence will be the same. So like when we were a 6-person company, the stakes felt just as high as when we are now a several 100-person company, customers all over the world, offices everywhere, you know, like the emotional impact feels the same. So you should know as you're going along that every challenge you're facing, that's the hardest challenge you've faced so far. And it's going to feel all encompassing. And then later you're going to look back and you're going to say, how quaint. But the emotional impact will always be the same. So you gotta chill out. You gotta figure out how to handle it, figure out how to let the stress like evaporate sometimes, figure out how to, be in the moment and connect with your family and not be thinking about it constantly, because it won't get easier. The stress will, like the things you're dealing with will just become more complicated. But if you can figure out a good cadence, then you in the same way that you dealt with the early stuff, you'll be able to deal with the later stuff.
Yeah, I love hearing that for you, because I felt it myself as a founder, but I think from the outside looking in, especially at a company that's like gone on the trajectory you guys have had, raised so much money, like a lot of times from the outside looking in, you might think like, oh, I'm sure they're partying, I'm sure they're having a great time. And the reality is like, you probably are, but it's just as stressful, it's just as hard as anybody else.
We're having a good time, but I wouldn't describe it as partying. We're building out and grinding and trying to keep delivering value. So.
Awesome. Cool, man. Well, appreciate having you on the show. It was great. I'm sure founders learned a lot listening to you.
Great. Thank you for having me.
If you listen to this episode and the show and you like it, I have a huge favor to ask for you. Well, it's actually a really small favor, but it has huge impact. But whichever app you're listening to this episode on, take it out, go to a Product Market Fit show and leave a review, please. It's going to help. It's not just going to help me, to be clear. It's going to help other founders discover this show, because the algorithms, whether it's Spotify, whether it's Apple, whether it's any other podcast player, one of the big things they look at is frequency of reviews. It's quantity of reviews. And the reality is, if all of you listening right now left reviews, we would have thousands of reviews. So please take literally a minute, even if you're just writing like great podcast or I love this podcast, whatever it is, just write a few words. Obviously, the longer the better, the more detailed the better, but write anything, leave 5 stars, and you will be helping me, but most importantly, many other founders just like you discover the show. Thank you.